All right, thank you everybody for being here. Welcome to Studio X in EMS. We are delighted to have David Rosenboom with us for this week and the next. And he's David is a composer, performer, interdisciplinary artist who was a student here in the late 60s and has gone on to write some incredible works and hold some esteemed positions at York University, Mills, Cal Arts.
Mm-hmm.
And
those are the big three.
The big three. Right. So he's giving a talk today on circuits and fingers, and I'm really looking forward to it. So I also want to give a thank you to Anastasia, who put this entire 2-week residency together and is kind of the brain behind it all. And I also want to thank my TAs, Xavier, who got all this set up. I did nothing. And Jinju, who is here going to be taking some pictures for historical purposes. So without further ado, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you. And don't take me as an example. I'm sure I'm violating an important studio rule here with my caffeine, but it's a busy time. So anyway, I'm glad to be here. I know we only have an hour, so I'm going to try to jump in. And it was suggested that I really am talking about what is an instrument, ideas about design that relate to things having to do with electronics. And so it was suggested that I at least start by focusing on an instrument that Don Buchla and I designed together called the Touche. We worked on that during the year 70. I think we started in July of 79 and finished probably around April or so of 80, and had always when there was a new instrument launch, there was a huge party, and KPFA Radio would host that party. I still have the cassettes of that radio show, which it's a high security document. No, I'm kidding. People would say anything they wanted to do, but anyway. So it was the idea that we were going to make one. Now Don was not really a black and white keyboard person, right? He didn't really like the black and white keyboard, but he did make several instruments that did have black and white keyboards. But one thing that really drove a lot of Don's design ideas was his friends and people that he wanted to make instruments for, and so he would have certain models. And so I guess 2 keyboard players that were very close friends of his were me and J.B. Floyd, great pianist. And so we hatched the idea. I had been out there several times, meeting in the 70s. I was at York University and I had a sabbatical, and I came out there and we worked on developing what was called the 300 system, which was one of his computer-controlled analog systems that was a great system, really beautiful system. And then one thing led to another, and finally decided, okay, we're going to take a stab at making a digital keyboard instrument. And so the idea was to make them a sort of maximally timbrally broad instrument with minimum means. And so we decided to settle on focusing everything around nonlinear wave shaping. Are you familiar with what that means? Some of you, yes. Some of you, no. Okay, I'll show a little bit. So Don made his first actual digital oscillator in hardware, which was actually a 300 series module that would fit in a modular system like that. And it was the only time in my experience of watching Don as a circuit designer, and he was a virtuoso circuit designer, the only time he ever made a prototype. Because he would just go from circuit diagram to PC board layout, panel design, and then hopefully it worked. Now, if you were one of the people who bought serial number 1, you would find that there were a few carvings on the circuit board and a few resistor jumpers going here and there, but when something needed to be corrected, but they generally worked. But he did a wire wrap version of this digital oscillator, and got it to go. So it's digital sound generation, but in hardware, right? So and then well, I'll show you more of the architecture later. But in any case, digital sound generation, and then an analog back end, which had its signal outputs went through the. It's kind of a very unique, kind of famous Buchla gate structure, which is a combination low-pass filter and VCA, but not as separate units, as an integrated circuit, where the concept was that the decay of the spectrum caused by the low-pass filter and the decay of the amplitude were locked together in a way that simulated how the spectrum of a sound decays if it's moving away from you, if it's moving at sort of significant velocity away from you. That was his concept, and it was at least it was a metaphor for that idea was in the circuitry, and that's one of the things that gave the Buchla instruments their most significant sound. You could say that's a Buchla sound. It was those gates that really were key in making that. So we kept that as a back end for the signal outputs. And then there was what we call the MARF, multi-arbitrary function generator, which was basically a hardware envelope generator where the length of the envelopes could be infinite because it was controlled by a microprocessor. So you could put a zillion breakpoints. And you could, so you could make these long controls, voltage controls that came out of it, and it was 64 channels, so there were 64 of those, so they could be attached to virtually every sound generating parameter in the instrument. And it was under computer control, so that you could put logic decisions at every breakpoint. So you could say, okay, proceed if key 1 is depressed, otherwise loop back to here. Or if some sensor you plug into the instrument is doing something, and you can make, or jump ahead, or you can make all these logic decisions in the envelope structure. So so that's it. And then at the center of it, I designed the software for it and chose to use a Motorola a Texas Instruments 9900 processor, which was one of the first fully orthogonal 16-bit microprocessors. So you had 16-bit registers, and it was great. TI had a drop on the microprocessor business at that moment, and they eventually came up with the 99000, which was a bigger one, and then somehow it just disappeared, and Intel took over and everything took over. But and it ran an operating system that was a derivative of one that ran on the Digital Equipment Corporation PDP-10, which was really pretty powerful. And so I chose to use that, and a guy named, I'm blanking on it, maybe he'll come up with it, had a company in Sausalito, California called Marin Chip Systems. And he had made these circuit boards to run on what was called the S100 bus, which was a card bus from the 70s, where small computers could plug in cards and so on. So that's what it was. And he happened to be the guy, his name, I'll blank on it, maybe I'll think of it. One day I went over there to get these circuit cards from him, and he said, let me show you what I've been working on. And he showed me something where you could lay out cards on a desktop in different kind of ways. And I go, what do you call that? I call it Autodesk. And then he said, no, I'll show you something else. And then he showed me ways you could design things. And he said, what do you call that? I call it AutoCAD. And so that was where it started. And he took off and developed that. Anyway, that's a little bit of history, but there's history in this. So let me show you the instrument itself. And actually, let me get my call it a cat spooker, or you could call it a laser pointer. So this is the instrument, and everything was controlled. There it is. We can't really see it on the
Doesn't really
screen.
reflect off the screen, yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't work, it reflects off the screen. Okay, so everything is controlled off this panel. What you don't see, you'll see in another slide, is you need a monitor sitting on top to do, you can control, you could program everything from these keyboards. There's these data entry buttons and so on. You could also, this would be the way that the average user would use it. You could also, and I did on my own version of it, connect it to 10-inch floppy drives and, you know, in a terminal and so on, so you could program. So let me go on and show you some other pictures. Just a close-up. So one thing, the way in which we worked, and I would say if any of you are familiar with the 2 and 300 system modules, if you have some over there, when we would sit down and talk about designing a module, it all had to start with what's the compositional purpose of this, right? And then from that conceptual discussion would arise a design for a front panel. Not the circuitry yet, but a panel, because that was going to be the interface, right? That's the user interface. So we designed the panel, and then Don would go out and design the circuitry to go behind it. And this was pretty much a similar idea. In the 300 series, the ones that we talked the most about were the source of uncertainty. You know that one? I claim inventing the name for that module. And because it was about, okay, Don, you don't have some, we need something that comes from stochastic music. And so that led to the source of uncertainty module. And then the programmable spectral processor, which was a modulatable, multi-band pass filter thing. And the kinesthetic input port, which was one of the keyboard designs, stuff like that. So we started out by looking at that, and so the panel is designed from that point of view. So you got to have in a keyboard instrument a master volume, right? So, and then buttons that determine whether you're playing or whether you're editing, and then the instrument. You could have two what we call instrument definitions active at a time in the instrument. And so we had multiple parallel, not waveform generators, but wave shaping generators. If any of you saw the Salmar construction talk last night, I talked about parallel wave tables that you could fade back and forth. You could fill one with data while you're listening to this one, and then you could pan over to this one and so on. That was a principle that came out of that instrument. This had a similar idea, but it was not wave shapes, but wave transforming tables or wave shaping tables. And so you could pan back and forth between instrument A and instrument B. So you would be able to do that in this section here. So you would have, there are no numbers showing here, but if it was running, you would, and you pick these are panning speeds. So these are panning speeds, and then you can hit here and it'll pan over to that instrument, or you can pan to the middle and you listen to both, a mix, or you can pan to the right and you pick the speed that you want to make this transformation. Very powerful tool in performance, right? For something which is all about you getting your hands on the instrument. You can do all this in software now, it's relatively trivial. But getting your hands on stuff, which was still in intention, maybe hanging over from analog days, which we're now back in, where you want to have your hands on the instrument, right? So that's the way that worked. And then you could shift it up and down by octaves. And then this was something that I was kind of proud of inventing. Manual partitioning. So let's say you're listening to two instruments at the same time. You could assign a breakpoint on the keyboard that would say, okay, the left hand will be playing this instrument, the right hand will be playing this instrument. You could then reverse it, you could clear it, reset it, or you could press the adapt button. So I came up with an algorithm that tried to follow, let's say you're improvising, it tried to follow what you were doing and infer where the division of your hands was. So that the instrument separation that's assigned to the left and right hand would be according to where your hands are and what you're doing. So it would look at how close they are, what's the density of this, how far apart, what's a threshold of separation that it would determine. It was pretty cool because you could run all over the keyboard and you'd have these instruments following you.
That's code based or circuit? What like?
That was code based.
Yeah.
Okay, and then data entry buttons where you could program stuff. Show you later. Ability to tune the instrument like you can, when you want to tune your violin, you could tune the instrument to whatever you're playing. And time scaling, you could make everything go a little faster or slower depending on you might have pre-programmed different time values. And then the basic parameters, parameter articulation. So there was, and these are offset knobs. So these are the main parameters for the sound synthesis: pitch, FM frequency, FM index. And this was, of course, in the time of the very controversial purchase of the FM patent by Yamaha from John Chowney. That's a long story. I can tell you a lot about that. And then what we call timbre. Now, timbre is, I'll show you a little more graphically later, but it is the size of a window into a wave shaping table. So let's say, think of a axis like that, and it's memory, okay? And a waveform of some kind is generating the memory address lookup numbers. So in this case, most of the time it was a sine wave, okay? So if it's a line going like that, it's linear. So what goes in comes out. So if it goes this way, this goes this way, and the sample comes out following what the driver is. If it goes like this, right, then it's going to add distortion. Basically, it's a very sophisticated distortion unit, right, that wave shaping. And but the amplitude of that sine wave going into the lookup table is controllable. So if it's very narrow, you're only looking at this much of the table. If you widen it, you're looking at all of the table. I'll show you a little bit more graphically about that. But what if you're modulating that? Right, that window.
Chaos.
That gives you a whole other world of timbre control. And that's what's timbre modulation. So timbre modulation frequency, timbre modulation index, and then gate level is the final output of that low pass, that Buchla gate. Right. So these are the things we wanted to have our fingers on. And then programmed stimuli, these would be determined in the basic software that you could program without a terminal. You could define certain stimuli, and they could be, in addition to the keys, they could be buttons. And they could be either on-off toggle, or they could be momentary switches. So if you wanted, you could program these to mean anything you want, right? And believe it or not, you could load and store programs onto cassette tapes. That's where that came from.
What would be stored on the tape, like control data or sound?
No, it would be your instrument designs, your
The patch information.
all sorts of parameter stuff, things having to do with the MARF, and so on. So this was my unit, which reached a point of not functionality, and it's now maybe 10, 15 years ago, and it's now in the hands of Rick Smith, who worked for Buchla and has an instrument. He's a master at restoring old instruments, and he's in Vancouver, and he has a big collection there of instruments that he's been restoring. So that was my setup, and so you can see I added a floppy drive and the monitor you have to have no matter what, and then I had a terminal. That's what it looked like. The back of it is kind of interesting too, because it had a lot of interesting ways to connect to the outside world. That one's a little out of focus, I apologize, so let's look at the close-up. So you'd have signal outputs, mono, stereo, and quad. The quad was a spatialization, kind of quasi-spatialization thing that used an all-pass network. I don't know if you know what that is, but it's, basically it's a set of filters that change the phase relationships of the signals and the outputs, that if you set it up in a room like this, it would give you the sense of kind of spatial movement. It's a balance to and from tape video to the monitor, RS-232 for connecting to a terminal, and then you could have control voltage outputs, so you could control other things. So various program 1, program 2, key press, tablet. It had an XYZ tablet on the keyboard. I don't think, maybe you didn't see that, but actually, there, I forgot to talk about this. This was a tablet that you could move left and right and get separate outputs and pressure, right? It's basically area of skin contact. And that could be used as a control, but also as a source of programming, actually. And then, so the tablet outputs. And then you'd have status inputs. Those are for outside signals. Sustain 1, 2, you could plug in pedals. Program stimulus 9 and 10, those were like those buttons, but there's a couple more of them that you could plug in from the outside. And then the control voltage inputs, you could control the system, the instrument itself, from external control voltages. And then the external ones would show up in the software. You could direct them to something, to some parameter control. And then these I added. These were connectors that I added to my unit that allowed me to connect to all kinds of other things, digital controls to various sensor units. I built a sensor interface. I'll show you. That's what it looked like on the inside. Lots of ribbon cables. And there you can see a little closer up view. That's a nightmare to maintain, but it's it's there. And Don and I signed Model 1, serial number 7. There were only 7 of these made, I think, or maybe 8. And then, all right, so here's another block diagram. So it had the 9900 CPU, 64 kilobytes of memory. And then it had, the programs were the basic software was stored on read-only memories that were used there. A disk controller card, if you had that. There's a display driver that would actually show you a display of the 64 channels of the MARF going up and down, so you could watch it. Any other thing you want to plug in, keyboard, panel interface, here's the 64 channel function processing unit, back panel, and so on. And then the Model 360 was the digital wave shaping signal source. That was the digital oscillator that Don made. So we would actually draw wave shaping table charts like that. And that would give us the definition of a certain timbre range, or timbre array, or timbre world, that would then get loaded into the proms. You could also load them in from external software on my instrument, and so on. And then that data would go in, and it's you had brute force hand stuff, right? So 000 to FFF, hexadecimal notation. Okay. I wrote a manual. That's just a picture of the manual, the Touche User's Guide. And since we called it the Touche, you know, there's derivative words there. You know, the touche, the French organ stop or key, touche, the fencing, right? So I named the programming language Foil. which stands for Far Out Instrument Language.
Nice.
There it is with the, so this display is now showing, this is one page of displays. This is showing you a bunch of, these are all names of instrument programs that have been programmed in. And then you can go pages, you can copy and initialize them, and then you could move a cursor with that pad over here. You could move a cursor around, and so you move it, and then you tap it, and that would be the same as like clicking your mouse. So here's a page of programming. And this is programming, so it's not a very good, I'm sorry, it's just a photograph of the screen, and I don't have the instrument anymore. So, but these are lines of the MARF. So there would be time parameters, delays between going from one breakpoint to another, something having to do with, whether it's a step or an interpolated, and then the voltage level, and then what to do with it. So stop or sustain or blah, blah, and then where is it going to go? And these are actions that it would have to take place once it reached that point. So it looked like that, and then these are things you can make it contingent on a stimulus value, either a jump or a loop or something that you're programming. But that's what the screen looked like. Very high resolution display. That's a joke. Okay, so here's a display of a particular wave shaping function. So you can imagine the sine wave scanning maybe this part, and you get this little wiggly thing, and then it goes over here, and you get a bigger, much bigger, basically addition to harmonic or sometimes non-harmonic content to the waveform as you go through it. Here's one that's been restored. This was there was a Buchla Memorial Festival in San Francisco, and Rick I went up to play on that, and he'd brought down what had been restored and is functional, and had a display of a bunch of different instruments. That was just a few years ago. Oops. Okay, and then this is actually the inside of one of those brochures that, if you have it, described how we describe the instrument. So this was there's the manual partitioning thing, all this stuff, and it says, here's an instrument that puts the power of computer technology at your fingertips.
And you'll never be keyboard.
Yeah.
Again.
Right, never do keyboard again. Right, exactly. So, we were having fun with this. I'll play you an example of what it sounded like. I have a record called Future Travel, which I produced very soon after the instrument was designed. Recorded it at Francis Coppola's studio in San Francisco, Zoetrope Studios. And it has the touche running foil, and it also has a 300 system running a language called Patch 4. Patch 4 was another. I didn't write that. A guy named Doug Crow wrote the code for that, and it was a system that ran on an Intel 8080 CPU, 8-bit computer. And so, but the connectors that I put on the back of my machine allowed me to go back and forth. So I could actually drive the touche with Patch 4, or I could run it with foil, or both at the same time. So foil would actually be determining the instrument specifications and all the timbres, and Patch 4 might be giving it sequence information, for example. And so I designed programs for this. And but this uses the logic controllable function generator to its max. And maybe you'll hear this. chose that one because what I'm doing as a performer is in this case, I'm choosing various harmonic and subharmonic series relationships that are being articulated in the pitch structure of this whole thing by touching things. And I can transpose, by touching things, transpose the whole thing. And I can cause it to take different logic decisions in the sequences that are coming along. So that's what's going on there. But what you're hearing is the sound, the sound of the instrument with certain particular instrument definitions. Now, of course, that could be infinite. Here's another example of a piece. That was about 1980, 81, came another piece that I did collaboratively with Jacqueline Humbert, who's a performance artist, and we did a bunch of songwriting together. A piece called Daytime Viewing, which was, it was about that. It was about television culture. And I did orchestrated the entire project. Started out first as a theater project, and then eventually came out as a cassette, and has been recently re-released as a CD on Unseen Worlds Records. And just as a different example of kind of how it sounded, here with a little bit more free some more free improvisation over a different kind of song structure.
She was a survivor through no choice of her own.
Different range of kind of things you can do with a touche. So everything was electronically synthesized, including what sounded like claves and everything else. So, so that's just arrangement. I did then a lot of pieces with it over a period of time, but one that was particularly a big deal example of what I call propositional music, music built from sort of modeling, was a piece called Zones of Influence, which was a concert-length work for a solo percussionist where the instruments all have sensors on them. And I built a sensor box that could connect directly to the touche, and then developed a series of 5 movements that last about an hour and 15 minutes or something like that, which was done with the touche. And that was a setup at the 1984 New Music America Festival that took place at CalArts, actually, this one. And just to show you what it might look like in a big setup. And then this was my sensor box, as such as it is now in my archive, with faded pieces of paper. But a graduate student at Mills College and I put this together, a guy named Toyoji Tomita, who was a great trombonist and got involved with electronic music. He's no longer alive, unfortunately. So it had 8 channels of circuitry designed to take sensor inputs. Could be piezo sensors or, whatever. And so it had controls for sensitivity, gain, various kinds of filtering, and so on, and envelope following. And the envelope following was dual level. So you would, when the signal reached a certain threshold, you'd get a pulse. And when it continued up to another threshold, you'd get a different pulse. So you could sense, let's say, a low level separately from a higher level and route them separately. And then this connected to the touche. There it is in my kitchen, the back end of it. So each one, you'd have these separate levels. This little piece of paper would actually tell you what they actually were. But, the inputs for the signals, outputs from the filters and so on, and the multi-level envelope generators. They came out in banana plugs because I was going to be able to hook them up to, let's say, a modular system. But the multi-collector connector here would take all this into the touche. Right? Yeah, so there's so you would have the low pulse, the high pulse, the envelope follower signal, preamp out, filters in and out, etc. And here's an example from that piece. This is from first movement, in which the percussionist is playing three snare drums, actually, low, medium, and high pitched, and everything is programmed to follow different kinds of ways he interprets a score, dynamic changes and various kinds of things. But it's driving the touche. It sounds like this. Stop it there, and I marked it original touche. I subsequently now have developed what I call Touche 2, which is a big giant reactor program, essentially. And I've been using that a lot lately. And here's the same piece with that program, which is the screen is shown there on the monitor on the right. That's a picture from, I was really lucky to have a 50-year retrospective at the Whitney Museum in the new Whitney, which opened in 15 or something. And they decided they wanted to open their new performance space with a 4-event series of my work, which was really incredible. And so we did that piece, and it looked like that. Here is a picture of the main panel interface of what I call Touche 2. So this is a good example here of the wave shaping. These are the wave shaping tables. In this case, again, 2 instruments, similar to the original touche. Various ways of panning back and forth between them, again, similar to the touche. In this case here, I've just made arbitrarily an 8-segment version of the multiple arbitrary function generator, although if you get inside the programming more detailed, you can get access to much more than that. But just from the panel, you have a timing value, or a timing, you have a level value, you have interpolation, in this case is continuous, you can determine how much interpolation, and then actions. So this says go to the next segment. There's not, I don't see one here that's got a very interesting program, but you can, all right, jump to number 8, et cetera. So you can set all these conditions. There are, you know, these are continuous control inputs and arbitrarily assignable functions. And the same kind of, when I say we, the design I did, worked on collaboratively with a programmer named Martijn Zwartis, who did a lot of programming for Native Instruments, actually. Now has his own companies in Holland. And he was at CalArts at the time that we did this together. And then the quad space and various other kinds of modulation ability. And you can, the design of these things can be very systematic, actually. So you can design one of these, I forgot, one of these adds odd harmonics to the waveform. Another one adds even harmonics to the waveform. And as you expand out the window. But again, you can have, the scanning window can be this narrow or that wide, right? And you can move around the center, actually, if you want to do it that way. So the new Touche 2 in a different part of Zones of Influence, and this is available on a double CD from Pogus Productions. And it sounds like this. Was just simply a reloading of a new instrument definition, right? So that all can happen. So the score, I think we probably don't have time to look at this, but I was going to perhaps look at, there is a score for this. Should I take a look at it?
Sure.
All right. All right, so I have to come out of this for a second. I recently, the piece was not documented. Look, there we are. Was not documented, where it is here. Well, I'll just go here. There's a, I just have a new album, so if you go to my website, you get the promo for it. It could be interesting to look at because it is, there's Don and me playing a duet together. Let's see, where did I put this? Must be here. Yeah, here it is. Because it was a bear of a piece to document. So just to run through pages of the score, just to show you the kinds of things that I had to do. There's all sorts of notes and instructions and so on. But here's a page that shows you, those are the wave shaping tables that are used for the piece, right? They're stored in memory, and they each have very, particular characteristics that are very carefully designed. In other words, they're not, you can draw them arbitrarily, but there is a way to be very specific about it. There's a set of polynomials called Chebyshev polynomials you can use to actually control the harmonic structure of waveform. And the old and the new instruments, and then each movement has a particular design and these are tables, these are actually tables of data that go to the melodic and other parameters of the piece, and the whole piece is based on ways to transform what I call an origin shape to a target shape. So it's about transformation of something. As you could think of it as variation, but it's like morphing in a way. You know, if you start out with a carrot and you're turning it into an elephant, at what point does it lose its resemblance to a carrot and start to look like an elephant? I'm doing that I'm thinking of that in an auditory way, how your memory recognizes things. So, and then all those shapes are here, and here are all the data tables for the shapes. So if somebody wants to do this piece with their own system, the data is all there, and you can. It's a big project, but you can do it, right? So everything is there. So how you document there. So this shows. This is the shapes that are articulated in the snare drum movement, all of them, and each one and how they transform from one to another. And then the actual data is there. So each movement has its own setup and diagram like that. And it took me a long time to make this score, but I finally, decided I've done this piece a lot, recorded it and all that, and nobody else can do it because none of the material is available, so I finally decided to do that. Anyway, I just wanted to show you that very quickly. And that is freely downloadable. If someone wants, if you'd like to have it, you can have it. You just go to the website and you can find it. It was a 1980s composition, and all my scores are categorized by decade. And then you scroll down, you can find it. Here's another. I'm going to bypass that one because I think eventually it goes into another way of actually using a violin scan, which is it's a multiband parsing system. So the violin is playing only glissandos, and as it moves up and down, it activates different things as it goes into different frequency ranges. Part of the same piece, but I know we're getting close to being run out of time. Here's an example of using the instrument in an interactive way, not totally unlike what I'm going to do next Thursday in my concert, using a disc clavier and the Touche 2. So that's a Yamaha disc clavier driving the Touche 2 software. Well, that's my studio with a reactor program and my modular instruments. I'm going to be using some of that in the electric strings project, and which starts tonight and has a concert on Friday. And it's based on interfacing with frequency parsing and I'll be using an electric violin. And I use a very small modular setup that is designed specifically to be played by my electric violin. That's what it's designed to be. And this is an example of my new album that just came out about 3 weeks ago, in which the great trumpet player, electronic musician Sarah Reed, and she was a doctoral student of mine several number of years ago, and we've been collaborating a lot. And there are a lot of Touche 2 things in it and other things as well. Here's a little sample of a track from it. Dan, and so I leave a little time for questions or answers. So, anybody? Yeah.
My thoughts are like, how do you feel about MIDI polyphonic expression now that it's being like a thing that's being more adapted towards a lot of DAWs and especially musical instruments?
Right.
How do you feel like you draw like similarities from MPE and what you've been doing with Touche?
Well, you could certainly, I could certainly adapt the new version to MPE. I haven't been doing that very much because I've been interested in driving it with, although I played an example there of using a disc clavier. I also, and I will be doing this next Thursday too, I like actually using acoustic signals because of their somewhat unpredictability and their what I call deviant resonances. You know how there's a sort of a push-pull in the system, and there's not a clear boundary between this and this. It's not so discrete, so I like to push it around that way. That's just me. That's just what I use. My way, what I use to send signals back and forth is entirely OSC. So I use OSC for everything, just because it gives me so much flexibility. So I don't have a very deep answer for you about that, but I think it could certainly be adapted, and it certainly expands what MIDI used to be able to do. So that's an interesting thing. I like to tend towards data as data, and then I decide what the interface is. And so that's just me. That's just the way I like to work. You know, there's a reason Miller Puckett put out something called Pure Data, and he got away from the Max world because I sympathize with that. Because, it's just data, you do with it what you want, and then you manipulate data as data. So, that's my tendency my way of working, that's all. Yeah. MPE has certainly got great potential, I think. Any other questions? Four minutes?
I have one sort of a technical question. I was looking at some of the wave tables on the score that you
Yeah.
downloaded, and I noticed that some of them in the middle don't cross through zero. They're
That's
sort of-
right.
And which means if you were to modulate those with a low amplitude sine wave, you would get a bunch of DC offset.
Yeah.
Right? How do you? Is that a problem, or you just
Well, you
ignore
would,
it?
but it would be turned into a waveform, right?
Right.
It's still, yeah, you're right, if you were just modulating in the middle, that's right.
Yeah, if the
you
range
would.
was like narrow and in the center.
That's
you're
right, it
just
was
getting
narrow
like-
in the center. So probably, I'd have to look at one of those and talk it through, but probably, I probably would have most likely designed it to be wider, with, more jitter on the outside of that. But that, I would do that by ear once I designed the shape itself.
Mhm.
But you're right, I mean, you can get into all kinds of weird stuff. And one thing about nonlinear wave shaping is it gets very complicated very quickly, right? So you have to really get down to details, and if you want to do subtle things, you have to be very clever about how you design those shapes. And of course, you can, these are all driven by a sine wave that's driving the tables. You could drive it with something other than a sine wave too, and then it would be like putting a complex wave through a complex distortion pedal, right? And you'd get a modulation, you'd get a change and so on, and sometimes it could be interesting to work that way, but it does get very, very, the wave gets very complex very quickly. Except in certain of them where you can design it to be specific to adding certain kinds of harmonics, like the odd harmonics or even harmonics, where you can be more accurate in predicting what the output's going to be with certain kind of settings. Does that make sense? Yeah.
So did you say this instrument is still available today, that we can play it?
I haven't distributed it.
Okay.
I've been asked about making an app out of it. And I guess my biggest fear about doing that is how long it would take to write a manual. So I just haven't done it. I just made it for my own pieces, and I haven't gotten into the idea of distributing it. I could, but I haven't.
Also, you are in no way in connection to a company called Expressive E where they have the touche, or that's what you were talking about?
What is it again?
Like, there's a company called Expressive E where they sell a product called touche.
No, I have nothing to do with that.
Nothing to do with it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Have you ever hooked one up to the touche too?
Hooked what up did you say?
One of the things that you're talking about, the touche.
What you're talking about? No, no. No, I really don't know much about that.
It's like it's a standalone expressive pedal where it has the depth and then you have X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
And you have like yaw and
Right.
pivot for
Right.
different types of functions you can program it to.
No, I've never used it.
Okay.
And I'm not affiliated in any way with that. We came up with this name in 1979. And had nothing to do with that, yeah.
What kind of stuff were you able to control with the XYZ pad that was on the left on the original touche?
What about it?
What were you able to control with the XYZ pad?
Anything you want, just consider it a source of continuous voltage, or, and you move around it, in 3 dimensions. Like a joystick, a 3-dimensional one. Although the pressure sensitivity was a little different in its feel than the left-right and up-down. So you have to get used to that. So it's an arbitrary source. You patch it to whatever you want. Yeah. Okay,
Thank you so much, David.
yeah, my pleasure.
Thank you.